On Monday morning, January 21st, 2025, thousands of federal employees across America woke up, got ready for work, and headed to their offices. But when they swiped their security badges at the door, nothing happened. Access denied. They tried again. Same result. Confused, they checked their phones. And that's when they saw the email. Your employment with the federal government has been terminated effective immediately. No warning, no severance negotiation, no goodbye. Just a form letter and a deactivated badge. By the end of that first week, over 10,000 federal workers had lost their jobs. And the man responsible wasn't a politician. It wasn't a committee. It was Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, now wielding government power in ways America has never seen before. This is the story of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, and how one billionaire's mission to shrink the federal government created chaos, heartbreak, and a political firestorm that's still burning. Stay until the end, because what happened in that first week reveals something profound about power, accountability, and what happens when Silicon Valley disruption meets the lives of ordinary government workers. The Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, wasn't a joke despite its cryptocurrency-inspired name. It was Donald Trump's most ambitious second term. The idea was simple. The federal government had become bloated, inefficient, wasteful. Billions of taxpayer dollars were being spent on programs that didn't work, employees who weren't productive, and bureaucracy that served no purpose except to perpetuate itself. Trump had promised to drain the swamp in his first term. Now he was bringing in someone with a track record of ruthless efficiency, Elon Musk. When Musk took over Twitter in 2022, he fired 80% of the staff. The company kept running. In fact, many argued it ran better. Trump wanted that same approach applied to the federal government. Cut the fat, eliminate redundancy, force the remaining workers to be more productive. And Musk, who had openly complained about government regulation strangling innovation, was eager to take on the challenge. On Inauguration Day, January 20th, Trump signed an executive order creating DOGE and appointing Elon Musk as its director. The announcement described it as a special advisory body with authority to recommend budget cuts, personnel reductions, and operational changes across every federal agency. But the language was carefully crafted to give Musk more than just advisory power. DOGE would have direct access to personnel files. It could recommend immediate terminations that would be automatically approved unless an agency head objected within 24 hours. And it had the authority to suspend access to federal systems pending review. In other words, Musk could effectively fire people, and unless someone stopped him quickly, those terminations would stand. What nobody fully understood at the time was how fast Musk would move. In the corporate world, mass layoffs take weeks of planning. HR departments prepare severance packages. Managers identify which positions are essential. Employees get advance notice. But Musk didn't follow corporate norms at Twitter, and he wasn't going to follow them in government. Over that first weekend, Musk's team at DOGE used AI algorithms to analyze federal employee productivity data. They looked at emails sent, documents processed, meetings attended, projects completed. They identified employees whose output fell below certain thresholds. They flagged entire departments that seemed to produce little measurable value, and they compiled lists, long lists. By Sunday night, the termination orders were ready, and on Monday morning, they were executed. The first people to realize something was wrong were security guards at federal buildings across the country. They started getting calls from confused employees. "My badge isn't working. Can you let me in?" The guards checked the system and saw the same status for dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of people. Access revoked. Employment terminated. Some guards, sympathetic to workers they'd known for years, tried to call supervisors. But the supervisors were equally confused. Nobody had been told this was coming. The termination emails arrived at different times throughout the morning, depending on time zones and when HR systems processed the orders. The emails were brief and impersonal, standard bureaucratic language. Your position has been eliminated as part of a government-wide efficiency initiative. Your final paycheck will include payment through today. Your health insurance will remain active for 30 days. Please return all government property within 48 hours. For many recipients, the shock was overwhelming. These weren't people expecting to lose their jobs. Many had worked for the federal government for decades. They had mortgages, kids in college, Retirement plans built around federal pensions, and now, with no warning, it was over. The human stories that emerged in the following days were devastating. A data analyst at the Department of Education, 15 years of service, learned she was fired while dropping her kids at school. She had been working on a program to track student loan forgiveness applications. Her job was gone. The program she managed, which helped millions of Americans, was now in limbo. An environmental scientist at the EPA, 22 years analyzing water quality data, got the email while having coffee at his desk. He had been in the middle of a multi-year study on contamination in industrial areas. That research, years of work, was now abandoned because nobody was left to continue it. A caseworker at Social Security, 18 years helping elderly Americans navigate benefit claims, found out she was terminated when her badge didn't work at the building entrance. She had appointments scheduled with seniors who depended on her help. Those people would show up to empty offices with nobody to assist them. And perhaps most heart-wrenching, a single mother working in veterans services learned she was fired in an email she read while sitting in a hospital room with her sick child. She had been helping veterans access health care benefits. Now she had no job and no way to pay her own medical bills. These weren't lazy bureaucrats. These weren't people abusing the system. They were accountants, IT specialists, caseworkers, scientists, analysts doing necessary work. But Musk's algorithm didn't measure necessity. It measured output metrics that often bore little relationship to actual value. By Wednesday, the scale of the firings became clear. Over 10,000 federal employees terminated in the first week. The Department of Education lost 20% of its staff. The EPA lost 30%. The National Institutes of Health, which conducts critical medical research, lost hundreds of scientists. Even the IRS, which Republicans often criticize but which actually generates revenue by collecting taxes, lost thousands of workers, meaning the government would collect less money, not save it. The reaction on social media was immediate and intense. The hashtag #ElonFiredMe started trending as fired workers shared their stories. A thread on Twitter from a former FDA inspector went viral. She explained that her job was testing food safety compliance at processing plants. Without inspectors, contaminated food would reach grocery stores. But her position had been eliminated because the algorithm determined she spent too much time traveling between sites and not enough time at her desk filing reports. Another viral post came from a former USDA employee who had worked on the school lunch program. He posted a photo of his termination email next to a photo of kids eating lunch at a rural school. His caption read, "I made sure these kids got fed. Now I can't even feed my own." The emotional weight of these stories created a narrative that even some Trump supporters found uncomfortable. This wasn't about cutting waste. This was about real people losing their livelihoods with no warning and no safety net. But Elon Musk's response was characteristically defiant. He posted on Twitter, "Government spending is out of control. Hard decisions are necessary. These people will find other jobs. The private sector is more efficient anyway." When pressed by reporters about the lack of warning, Musk argued that advance notice would have allowed employees to sabotage systems or delete files. He pointed to cases at Twitter where departing employees had tried to damage the platform. He claimed the same risk existed in government. Critics found this reasoning absurd. These were civil servants, not disgruntled tech workers. They had taken oaths to serve the public. The idea that thousands of them would simultaneously become saboteurs was insulting and unsupported by evidence. The practical consequences of the mass firings became apparent almost immediately. At the Social Security Administration, wait times for benefit applications doubled within days. Seniors calling the helpline found themselves on hold for hours because there weren't enough workers to answer phones. The backlog of disability claims, already significant, ballooned. People who had waited months for decisions would now wait even longer. At the Department of Veterans Affairs, similar chaos ensued. Veterans trying to access health care benefits encountered closed offices and unanswered phones. Some VA hospitals had to reduce services because administrative staff who processed appointments and insurance claims were gone. At the APA, ongoing environmental investigations were halted mid-process. Companies accused of pollution violations suddenly found themselves free from scrutiny because the investigators assigned to their cases had been fired. Environmental groups warned that this wasn't efficiency, it was a free pass for polluters. The IRS situation was particularly ironic. The agency had lost auditors whose job was to catch tax cheats. Experts estimated that every dollar spent on IRS enforcement generates $5 to $10 in recovered revenue. By firing auditors, the government wasn't saving money, it was losing money. But Musk dismissed these concerns. He argued that remaining workers would be more productive, that AI and automation would fill gaps, that the federal government had been overstaffed for so long that people had forgotten what lean operations looked like. His defenders pointed out that corporations function with far fewer employees relative to revenue than the government does relative to budget. Why should government be any different? What made the situation even more contentious was the apparent contradiction between Musk's efficiency crusade and his own company's relationship with government money. SpaceX has received billions in NASA contracts. Tesla has benefited from electric vehicle subsidies. Starlink received government funding to expand rural internet access. Musk's companies thrived in part because of government support. Now he was dismantling the very government agencies that provide oversight, regulation, and funding. Critics call this hypocrisy. Musk called it results-oriented thinking. He argued that his companies delivered value for taxpayer money. They built rockets. They produced cars. They connected rural areas. Government bureaucrats, he implied, just shuffled paper. This framing ignored the reality that much of government work is invisible until it stops happening. Food safety inspections prevent outbreaks. Environmental monitoring catches problems before they become disasters. Caseworkers help vulnerable people navigate complex systems. Just because this work doesn't produce flashy rockets doesn't mean it lacks value. By Friday of that first week, political leaders were forced to respond. Democrats, predictably, condemned the firings as cruel and reckless. They held press conferences featuring fired workers. They introduced legislation to reverse the terminations and restore protections for federal employees, but they lacked the votes to pass anything. Republicans were divided. Some, particularly those who had long campaigned on shrinking government, praised Musk and Trump. They argued this was exactly what voters wanted, that draining the swamp required bold action and that the bureaucracy would fight any attempt to reduce its size unless force was used. But other Republicans, particularly those representing districts with large federal employee populations, were nervous. Thousands of their constituents had just lost their jobs. Those people vote, and they're angry. Senator Susan Collins of Maine, often a swing vote, expressed concern about the speed and scale of the firings. She called for hearings to examine whether proper procedures had been followed. Senator Mitt Romney, never afraid to criticize Trump, went further, calling the mass terminations cruel and questioning whether they were even legal. The legal questions were significant. Federal employees have civil service protections designed to prevent exactly this kind of arbitrary termination. Those protections exist to insulate government workers from political pressure, to ensure they can do their jobs based on expertise rather than loyalty to whoever is in power. But Trump's executive order creating DOGE had been carefully crafted to bypass many of those protections. It invoked emergency authority and claimed that reducing government size was a national security imperative. Critics argued this was a pretext and that courts would eventually strike down the order. But that process takes time, and in the meantime, thousands of people were out of work. By the end of the first week, labor unions representing federal employees had filed multiple lawsuits. They argued that the terminations violated civil service law, that employees were denied due process, and that the use of AI algorithms to determine firings was discriminatory. They pointed out that the algorithm's metrics inevitably disadvantaged workers in certain roles. Field workers who traveled for their jobs appeared less productive than desk workers who spent more time on computers. Parents who took family leave showed lower output metrics. Older workers less familiar with digital systems filed fewer electronic reports. The algorithm, unions argued, was biased even if unintentionally, and using it to make irreversible employment decisions was unjust. What the lawsuits also revealed was how little oversight Doge itself had. Musk's team operated with almost no transparency. Nobody outside Doge knew exactly how the algorithm worked, what data it prioritized, what thresholds it used, whether it considered factors like seniority, expertise, or role importance. Musk argued that transparency would allow people to game the system, that if workers knew how the algorithm measured productivity, they would manipulate their behavior to look productive without actually being so. But refusing transparency also meant nobody could verify whether the firings were justified, whether the algorithm was accurate, whether mistakes had been. And as reporters dug deeper, they found clear mistakes. A highly regarded cancer researcher at NI, with dozens of published papers and millions in grant funding, had been terminated because much of her work involved long-term studies that didn't produce frequent measurable outputs. The algorithm saw gaps in her productivity metrics and flagged her for termination. A cybersecurity expert at the Department of Homeland Security, responsible for protecting government networks from hackers, was fired because his work was classified and therefore didn't appear in the databases Doge analyzed. The algorithm concluded he did nothing all day. These weren't isolated incidents. As the week progressed, more examples emerged of valuable workers fired because an algorithm misunderstood their roles. And once reporters started finding this case, public opinion began shifting. Even people who supported shrinking government started questioning whether this was the right way to do it. By Sunday, exactly 1 week firing began, the political landscape had changed. What had initially seemed like bold, decisive action now looked increasingly like chaos. Federal agencies were struggling to function. Workers who remained were demoralized and fearful services that Americans depended on were degrading. The human cost, the families thrown into financial crisis with no warning, was impossible to ignore. Trump, sensing the political danger, tried to distance himself slightly from the execution while defending the principle. He claimed he had told Musk to cut spend but hadn't micromanaged the detail. He suggested that if mistakes were made, they could be corrected. But that statement created its own problem. If the president admitted mistakes were made, what about the thousands of people already fired? Would they get their jobs back, their lost wages, an apology? Musk, characteristically, refused to back down. He insisted the firings were necessary and that the pain was temporary. He promised that within months, the reduced bureaucracy would function better than the bloated version replaced. He argued that critics were simply defenders of the status quo, people who benefited from waste and didn't want it. But increasingly, Musk's confidence seemed disconnected from reality because the reality on the ground was chaos, and that chaos wasn't just affecting governments, affecting American, which is the Doge department. Millions of people are just too big, too weight, too bureaucratic. They see dysfunction and want. They respond to me about cutting in government. But those same people also they want veterans. They want their tax service abstract. This is voters who promise a government, not life. Food safety inspections don't have. These aren't glitches or crises. Musk's defenders argue that short-term or long-term technology work will become their right. 6 months from now, the whole government will function. Maybe AI will place much of the work that humans, or maybe this. As the moment when a billionaire with no government experience and no accountability was given power to upend thousands of lives, and the results were exactly as catastrophic as critics warned. As of now, 1 week in, the question is unresolved, but the human cost is already clear. 10,000 people, most of whom were doing valuable work, lost their jobs with no warning. Their families are struggling. The services they provided are degrading, and the man responsible is the richest person in the world, who will never experience a single consequence from any of this. That's the story of Doge's first week. Not a story of efficiency, not a story of innovation, a story of power, unaccountable power, wielded by someone who doesn't have to live with the consequences. And the scariest part? This is just the beginning. Because Musk has made it clear that this first wave of firings was just the start. More cuts are coming. More agencies will be targeted. More workers will open their emails and find out their livelihoods are gone. The question now isn't whether this will continue. It's whether anyone can stop it. And right now, the answer isn't clear.